14 assistants quit in 3 weeks. They ran from the thrown glass, the bitter insults, and the cold, dead eyes of a man who ruled a criminal empire from a wheelchair. Elias Corvin was broken, and he wanted everyone else to break with him. Then came Clara. She didn't have a pristine resume or a tolerance for nonsense. She had past due rent and a hungry 4-year-old. When Elias threw a whiskey glass at her head, Clara didn't flinch. She picked up a broom. Rain lashed against the scratched acrylic of the bus shelter, soaking the hem of Clara's only decent trousers. She checked her phone. Negative $12. That was the magic number sitting in her checking account. It was a number that meant the pink eviction notice taped to her apartment door was no longer a threat. It was a countdown. She shoved the cracked phone back into her pocket and pulled her thin coat tighter around her shoulders. Toby was at Mrs. Higgins's apartment, watching cartoons and eating off-brand cereal. He needed a refill on his asthma inhaler by Friday. Today was Tuesday. Clara had exactly 3 days to pull off a miracle. The bus groaned to a halt. She stepped on, ignoring the damp smell of wet wool and exhaust. Her destination was 40 minutes outside the city, a place where the cracked pavement gave way to smooth, winding asphalt flanked by ancient oaks. The Corvin estate. Clara knew what the Corvin family did. Everyone in the city knew. They owned the shipping yards, the unions, and the politicians. They dealt in violence. 6 months ago, a rival family had planted a bomb in Elias Corvin's armored SUV. The blast killed his driver and shattered his spine. The undisputed king of the underworld was now a prisoner in his own body, paralyzed from the chest down. She walked the last half-mile from the bus stop. Massive iron gates loomed in the fog. Security cameras tracked her every step. A man in a dark trench coat stood by the intercom assault rifle, slung casually over his shoulder. He patted her down with professional detachment before buzzing her inside. Vincent Elias's right-hand man waited at the heavy oak front doors. He wore a charcoal suit that cost more than Clara's life insurance policy. He looked exhausted. Dark circles bruised the skin under his eyes, and his jaw was tight. "You're the temp agency replacement," Vincent said. It wasn't a question. He looked her up and down, taking in her damp hair and scuffed loafers. "You won't last until lunch." "I need the hours," Clara said flatly. Vincent let out a dry, humorless laugh. "Hours? Right. Listen to me carefully. Elias is not a patient man. He is angry. He is in pain. He throws things. He screams. He will say the most vicious, deeply personal things he can think of just to watch you cry. He wants you to quit. I don't cry easily. The girl yesterday lasted 45 minutes. He told her she was a waste of oxygen and threw a hot cup of black coffee at her chest. "Do you have a thick skin, Clara? I have a child to feed." Vincent stared at her for a long moment. "God help you. Come on." The interior of the house was suffocating. High ceilings, dark mahogany, and the faint underlying scent of antiseptic and stale cigarette smoke. Armed men stood at the intersections of the sprawling hallways. They didn't look at her. She was a ghost, another disposable body in a revolving door of caregivers. Vincent stopped outside a set of double doors. He didn't knock. He just pushed them open and stepped aside. The room was vast and shadowed. Heavy velvet curtains choked out the midday light. A massive, flat-screen television played security feeds in silent, flickering black and white. In the center of the room, positioned near a roaring fireplace, sat Elias Corvin. He was a large man built for violence. Broad shoulders strained against a dark grey Henley shirt. His face was sharp, aristocratic, but ruined by a jagged purple scar that ran from his temple down to his jawline. His legs were hidden beneath a thick woolen blanket. His hands rested on the armrests of a high-tech motorized wheelchair, his knuckles white with tension. He didn't turn around. "I told you I didn't want another one." Elias's voice was gravel and ash. It scraped against the quiet of the room. "She's here to organize the files and handle your correspondence." "Elias," Vincent said softly from the doorway. "Get her out." Clara stepped forward. Her cheap shoes squeaked against the polished hardwood. The sound was deafening. Elias whipped the wheelchair around. The motor whined sharply. His eyes were dark, hollow, and burning with a terrifying kind of hatred. He looked at her. Really looked at her. He took in the damp coat, the cheap clothes, the exhaustion etched around her mouth. "Look at this," Elias sneered. He grabbed a crystal tumbler of amber liquid from the side table. "They send me strays now. Are you supposed to bathe me, feed me, wipe my mouth when I drool? I'm here to do your paperwork, Mr. Corvin," Clara said. Her voice didn't shake. Elias locked eyes with her. He raised the heavy crystal glass and hurled it directly at her face. Clara didn't scream. She didn't raise her hands. She simply tilted her head. The glass shattered against the mahogany doorframe behind her, showering her shoulder with shards and expensive scotch. The silence that followed was heavy, lethal. Elias breathed heavily, his chest rising and falling, waiting for the tears, waiting for her to run out the door like all the others. Clara calmly brushed a piece of broken crystal off her damp coat. She looked around the room, spotted a small broom and dustpan leaning near the fireplace, and walked over to it. "You missed," Clara said. She began sweeping up the glass. "Do you want to try again, or do you want to show me where the files are?" Elias stared at her. For the first time in 6 months, he had absolutely nothing to say. Morning broke grey and unforgiving, matching the concrete skyline visible from Clara's kitchen window. She poured cereal into a plastic bowl, splashing a tiny bit of milk over the top, rationing it so it would last the week. "Mummy, are you going back to the scary house?" Toby asked, around a mouthful of toasted oats. His small hands gripped his spoon tight. He always knew when she was stressed. "It's just a big house, baby," Clara lied smoothly, wiping a smudge of dirt off his cheek. "And the pay is very good. I'll pick you up from Mrs. Higgins's right after. Keep your inhaler in your pocket, okay?" She kissed his forehead, smelling sleep and baby shampoo, and locked away the terror twisting in her gut. She had survived day 1. Barely. She had spent 9 hours organizing ledgers filled with numbers that could buy small countries, all while Elias sat in the corner, staring at her with predatory stillness. He had refused to speak to her. He had refused to eat the lunch the kitchen staff brought in. He just watched her, waiting for her to break. When Clara stepped off the bus and walked up to the iron gates of the Corvin estate, the guard in the trench coat actually raised an eyebrow. Inside, Vincent was waiting in the foyer holding a tablet. When he saw her, he stopped mid-stride. "You came back." "I told you I needed the hours," Clara replied, shrugging off her damp coat. "He broke 3 plates at breakfast," Vincent warned, his voice low. "The physical therapist quit. Elias grabbed him by the collar and threatened to crush his windpipe. He's in a foul mood." "Is the paperwork from the dockyards on the desk?" Vincent blinked. "Yes." "Clara, just be careful. He's testing the perimeter. He wants to see where your fences are." Clara nodded and walked down the long, silent hallway. She pushed open the double doors to Elias's study. The room was a disaster. Books were scattered across the Persian rug. A tray of scrambled eggs and toast was plastered against the far wall. Elias was positioned by the window, his back to the door, staring out at the rain-slicked grounds. Clara didn't say good morning. She walked to the wall, picked up the ruined silver tray, and began collecting the broken ceramic and cold eggs. "Leave it," Elias snapped. His voice was a whip crack in the quiet room. Clara ignored him. She piled the mess onto the tray. The wheelchair motor hummed as he spun around to face her. His jaw was clenched so tight the scarred tissue stood out stark white against his skin. "I said leave it. Are you deaf or just stupid?" "I'm keeping my workspace clean," Clara said, standing up. She carried the tray to a side table and grabbed a cloth to wipe the wall. "You're a rat," Elias spat. He wheeled himself closer. He moved with aggressive precision, stopping the heavy chair just inches from her legs. He had to crane his neck slightly to look up at her. A physical reality she knew drove him insane. "You scurry in here, soaking wet, wearing shoes that look like they were pulled from a dumpster, and you think you can just ignore me in my own house. I am doing exactly what I was hired to do, Mr. Corvin." Clara kept scrubbing the wall. "I'm not here to be your punching bag. I'm here to file the dockyard reports." "What's your price?" he demanded. Clara stopped wiping. She looked down at him. "My hourly rate is $25. "Don't play games with me," Elias snarled. He slammed a heavy fist onto the armrest of his chair. The sudden violence of the movement was jarring. His upper body was brutally strong, overdeveloped from compensating for his dead legs. "Everyone has a breaking point. What's yours? $1,000 to walk out that door and never come back." $5,000. Clara looked at the anger radiating from him. She didn't see a terrifying mafia boss. She saw a man trapped in a cage made of bone and nerve damage, lashing out because he couldn't run. She saw the same desperate frustration Toby got when his lungs wouldn't work right. "You don't have enough money to make me quit," Clara said softly. Elias let out a harsh breath, his eyes narrowing. He reached forward to grab a heavy leather-bound ledger from the edge of his desk, but his fingers slipped. The thick book fell landing with a loud thud on the floor, sliding just out of his reach. Elias froze. Clara watched his hands grip the armrests. He leaned forward, trying to hook the book with his fingers, but the angle was wrong. His core muscles wouldn't support the reach. He strained, a dark flush creeping up his neck. The more he struggled, the further the book slid. The air in the room grew thick with humiliation and rage. Clara knew if she offered to help, he would explode. If she ignored it, he would punish her for witnessing his weakness. She walked over. She didn't look at his face. She simply bent down, picked up the heavy ledger, and placed it squarely on his lap. "The shipping manifests are missing the signature from the union rep on page 4, Clara said, casually, turning her back to him and walking toward her filing cabinet. "I'll need you to authorize a courier to get that sorted before noon." Elias sat motionless. His large hands rested on the leather cover of the book. He stared at her back as she pulled out folders and began sorting them. She hadn't pitied him. She hadn't looked away in embarrassment. She had simply fixed the problem and moved on. For the rest of the day, Elias didn't throw a single thing. He sat in the silence watching her work. And when the clock struck 5 and Clara put her cheap coat back on, he finally spoke. 9 a.m. tomorrow. Elias said, his voice flat. "Don't be late." Clara nodded. "I'll be here." She walked out of the estate and into the cold evening air, her chest feeling a fraction lighter. She was surviving. She boarded the bus, pulling her phone out to check her bank app. A direct deposit from Corvin Enterprises was pending. $500, a daily rate. Clara closed her eyes and let her head rest against the vibrating glass. Toby was getting his inhaler. They were keeping the apartment. But as the dark trees of the estate faded into the distance, Clara realized the terrifying truth. The money was a lifeline, but the man in the wheelchair was a riptide, and she was already caught in the current. Wednesday brought sleet that coated the iron gates in thick grey ice. Inside the estate, the temperature was always set to a stifling 74 degrees. Clara stripped off her damp coat, hung it in the staff closet, and traded her wet boots for the indoor loafers she now kept under her desk. It had been 2 weeks, 14 days of organizing illicit ledgers, ignoring the heavily armed men in the corridors, and surviving Elias Corvin. He hadn't thrown anything since the crystal tumbler. Instead, he had shifted to a cold, suffocating silence, watching her work with the predatory patience of a starved animal. He wanted her to slip. He wanted her to ask a stupid question or show fear. Clara did neither. She treated the illegal weapons manifests with the same detached efficiency she once applied to dental clinic invoices. It was just math. Math paid Toby's rent. "Elias has a meeting at noon," Vincent said, appearing in the doorway of the study. He handed Clara a stack of red-tabbed folders. "Keep your head down. Don't speak unless spoken to. If voices get raised, step out into the hall." Clara took the folders. "Who is the meeting with?" "Dominic Russo." Vincent replied, his jaw tightening. "He runs the South Docks. He's old school. He doesn't like taking orders from a man who can't walk." Clara nodded, filing the folders onto her cart. She wheeled it into the main office just as the double doors swung open. Elias navigated his wheelchair to the head of the heavy oak conference table. He wore a tailored black suit that hung perfectly from his broad shoulders, concealing the atrophy in his lower body. He looked dangerous. He looked like a king. But Clara noticed the subtle, white-knuckled grip on his joystick and the tension drawing tight lines around his scarred mouth. Minutes later, Dominic Russo swaggered into the room. He was a thick, bull-necked man, wrapped in a camel-hair coat, smelling of cheap cologne and stale cigar smoke. 2 enforcers flanked him, their eyes darting around the room, before settling dismissively on Elias's chair. "Elias," Dominic said, dragging a chair out and collapsing into it without waiting for an invitation. "You're looking rested." The insult hung in the air heavy and deliberate. "Sit up straight, Dominic," Elias said. His voice was quiet, stripped of any emotion, but it carried a razor's edge. "You're in my house." Dominic chuckled a wet, rattling sound, but he shifted his posture. "I brought the dock reports. Short a few crates of the imported hardware. Customs got tight." "Customs didn't get tight," Elias replied, leaning forward slightly. "You got sloppy. You paid the wrong shift supervisor at Terminal 4. I told you to use the guy on the night rotation. Yeah, well, things move fast on the ground, Elias. Hard to see the full picture when you're stuck up here in the ivory tower." Dominic gestured vaguely toward Elias's legs. "Some things require a hands-on approach." Clara stood quietly in the corner, organizing the red-tabbed folders. She watched Elias's hands. They were trembling. Not from fear, but from a rage so absolute it was vibrating through his nervous system. "My reach is exactly as long as it has always been," Elias said softly. "Do not confuse my current seating arrangement with a lack of leverage." Dominic leaned over the table, pressing his palms flat against the wood. "I'm just saying, the men need leadership. Real leadership. Someone who can walk the docks. Someone who doesn't need a nurse to help him take a piss." The silence in the room shattered into something violent. Vincent stepped forward, his hand dropping toward the holster under his jacket. Dominic's men tensed. Elias didn't move. He stared at Dominic with dead, shark-like eyes. Clara calculated the distance. She looked at the fresh pot of scalding black coffee resting on the sideboard. She didn't think. She just moved. She picked up the silver coffee pot, walked briskly toward the table to refill Dominic's cup, and deliberately tripped over the heavy leg of his chair. The silver pot tipped. Near-boiling coffee cascaded over the table, splashing heavily onto Dominic's lap and soaking through his expensive trousers. Dominic screamed, leaping backward, his chair crashing to the floor. He slapped desperately at his burning thighs, swearing loudly. His enforcers jumped hands on their weapons, completely derailed by the sudden chaos. "Oh, I am so sorry," Clara said, her voice dripping with flat, unconvincing apology. She grabbed a handful of paper napkins and tossed them onto the puddled table. "My cheap shoes. The soles have zero grip." Dominic glared at her, his face purple with pain and fury. "You stupid, clumsy bitch." He raised a hand, stepping toward her. "Dominic!" Elias's voice cracked through the room like a gunshot. It wasn't quiet anymore. It was a roar that seemed to shake the mahogany walls. Dominic froze. Elias wheeled himself around the table, the motor humming aggressively until he was inches from Dominic. He reached up his massive hand, shooting out to grab Dominic by the collar of his shirt. He pulled the heavier man down violently, forcing Dominic to bend awkwardly to avoid choking. "You will apologize to my assistant," Elias whispered, his face inches from Dominic's, "and then you will leave my house. You will refund the lost hardware out of your own pocket. If you ever disrespect me in this room again, I will have Vincent cut off your legs, and we will see how well you walk the docks on bloody stumps. Do we understand each other?" Dominic swallowed hard, his eyes wide, the burn on his legs forgotten. "Yes. Yes, Elias." Elias shoved him backward. "Get out." Dominic and his men scrambled out of the doors. Vincent followed them, closing the doors softly behind him. The room fell deadly silent. The only sound was the dripping of coffee from the table onto the Persian rug. Elias slowly turned his wheelchair to face Clara. He stared at her, his chest heaving. "You spilled that on purpose." "He was upsetting the workflow," Clara said, picking up the fallen silver pot. "I'll get some club soda for the rug." Elias watched her walk away, his dark eyes unreadable. "You could have gotten shot, Clara." She paused at the door, looking back over her shoulder. "I've dealt with worse men for less money. Do you want me to bring the Terminal 4 files when I come back?" Elias stared at her for a long time, the tension in his jaw slowly released. "Yes, bring the files." Pain was a currency in the Corvin household. Elias paid it out in harsh words and broken glass, but he suffered it in silence. Clara had learned the signs over her first month. The sudden rigidness of his posture, the way his breathing grew shallow and rapid, the dark, sweaty pallor that crept over his face when the damaged nerves in his spine fired phantom signals to muscles that could no longer answer. It was a Tuesday afternoon. The rain had finally stopped leaving the estate grounds looking bruised and muddy. Clara was at her small desk in the corner of his study, cross-referencing a stack of offshore banking records. Elias was at his desk, reviewing a tablet. Suddenly his left leg kicked out, violently striking the heavy mahogany desk. Clara looked up. Elias gripped the armrests of his chair, his knuckles turning translucent. His right leg convulsed next a brutal jarring spasm that threatened to throw his upper body forward. He gritted his teeth, a low, guttural groan escaping his throat as he tried desperately to use his upper body strength to force his rebellious legs back into submission. He hated this. Clara knew he hated this more than the paralysis itself. The spasms were a mocking reminder that his body was still alive, just entirely out of his control. "Vincent!" Elias choked out his head, dropping forward, as another severe spasm hit. Clara stood up. "Vincent went to the city to handle the bank transfer. He won't be back for an hour." Elias's head snapped up. His eyes were wild, glazed with pain and humiliation. "Get out! Call a guard! Tell them, get out, Clara!" He didn't want her to see him like this. He wanted the guards, the men who were paid to be blind, deaf, and mute. "No," Clara said. She walked swiftly across the room. She didn't feel fear, and she definitely didn't feel pity. She felt the exact same hyper-focused adrenaline she felt when Toby woke up at 3 a.m., his chest heaving, his lips turning blue from a severe asthma attack. Panic was useless. Action was required. She knelt in front of his wheelchair. "I said get out!" Elias roared his hand, lashing out to push her away. Clara ducked his swinging arm and caught his wrist, pinning it to the armrest with surprising strength. "Stop fighting it. You're making it worse. Your muscles are misfiring because you're tense." His left leg kicked again, the heavy boot striking Clara solidly in the thigh. She winced but didn't back away. "Put your hands on the armrests and lean back." Clara ordered, her voice completely devoid of the deferential tone usually reserved for the boss. It was a mother's voice, absolute, unyielding. Elias blinked, startled by the sheer authority in her tone. He stopped fighting her grip and gripped the chair. Clara reached down and firmly grasped his left ankle. His leg was rigid as iron. Slowly applying steady, relentless pressure, she pushed his foot flat against the footrest, forcing the calf muscle to stretch out. "Breathe, Elias," she said, keeping her eyes focused on his boots. "In through your nose, out through your mouth. Count to 4. Elias was breathing in ragged, angry gasps. He stared down at the top of her head. She was kneeling on his expensive rug, her cheap trousers getting dusty, taking a beating from his spasming legs. And she wasn't flinching. Slowly the rhythmic pressure she applied began to work. The violent jerking subsided into mild tremors. The iron-tight muscles in his thighs began to loosen. Clara moved to his right leg, repeating the process, her hands, professional and grounding. Minutes passed. The only sound in the room was his heavy breathing and the ticking of the grandfather clock. When the spasms finally stopped, Elias slumped back against his chair, exhausted. Sweat beaded on his forehead. The jagged scar on his face was stark against his pale skin. Clara sat back on her heels, wiping a strand of hair out of her eyes. She reached up, grabbed a clean handkerchief from the box on his desk and handed it to him. He didn't take it. He just stared at her. "Why aren't you afraid of me?" Elias asked. His voice was a raw whisper. Clara finally looked up into his eyes. "Because you're just a man in pain. I've seen worse monsters on the 1st of the month when rent is due." Before Elias could respond, Clara's phone buzzed loudly in her pocket. It was a harsh, jarring sound. She pulled it out. The screen read, "Mrs. Higgins." Clara's heart dropped into her stomach. Mrs. Higgins never called during work hours unless it was an emergency. She stood up quickly, hitting answer. "Hello, is it Toby? Is he okay?" Clara asked, turning away from Elias, her voice tightening with instant panic. "He's fine, dear. He's fine." Mrs. Higgins's reedy voice crackled through the speaker. "But he used his inhaler 3 times today. His chest is sounding awfully tight. I think you might need to take him to the clinic before it gets worse." "Okay. I'll leave now. Keep him sitting upright. Don't let him run around. I'll be there in an hour." Clara hung up the phone, her hands shaking slightly. She turned around. Elias was watching her, his dark eyes sharp, processing the entire one-sided conversation. "Toby?" Elias asked softly. Clara froze. She had strictly separated her worlds. The mob boss in the wheelchair didn't need to know about the 4-year-old boy with bad lungs. It was safer that way. "My son," Clara said, her voice defensively flat. "He's sick. I need to leave early." Elias stared at her, the pieces clicking together in his mind. The cheap shoes, the desperate need for hours, the absolute refusal to back down from a man who terrified hardened criminals. She wasn't fearless. She was just terrified of something else, entirely. "Take my personal car," Elias commanded. Clara blinked. "What?" "No, the bus comes in 10 minutes. The bus takes 40 minutes to reach the city." Elias interrupted his voice, dropping into the authoritative timbre of a king giving an order. "Vincent is in the city with the armored SUV. The driver downstairs has the keys to the sedan. Tell him I said to take you." "Mr. Corvin, I can't." "Take the car, Clara," Elias said. He picked up his tablet, deliberately breaking eye contact. "And take tomorrow off. Paid. Go take care of your kid." Clara stood perfectly still for a second. Then she nodded, once grabbed her bag, and ran for the door. She didn't look back to see Elias watching the doorway, long after she had disappeared. Fluorescent lights buzzed like angry hornets in the ceiling of the free clinic. Clara sat on a cracked vinyl chair, holding Toby against her chest. The steady hiss of the nebulizer masked the sound of coughing from the waiting room. Toby's eyes were heavy, his small chest finally rising and falling with regular, unlabored rhythm. The plastic mask engulfed half his face, pumping albuterol into his tight lungs. Clara pressed her lips to his damp hair. She was exhausted down to her marrow. Through the smudged glass window of the treatment room, she could see Declan. Elias's driver stood near the clinic entrance, a broad-shouldered monolith in a dark, tailored suit. He hadn't spoken a word on the drive over. He simply blasted through 2 red lights, parked the luxury sedan on the sidewalk in front of the clinic, and stood guard. Every time a restless junkie or angry patient stepped too close, Declan merely shifted his weight. The crowd naturally parted around him, like water around a stone. "All done, Mama," Toby mumbled, pushing the plastic mask away, as the machine sputtered out the last of the medicine. "Good job, buddy," Clara whispered, wiping his face with a tissue. A harried doctor stepped in, scribbled something on a clipboard, and handed Clara a folded piece of paper. "He's stable. Keep him on the maintenance inhaler. If he flares up again, you need to go to the main hospital, ER. Settle up at the front. Settle up." Clara unfolded the paper. $180. It was a discounted rate, but to Clara it might as well have been 10,000. She pulled out her worn wallet, mentally, calculating the groceries she could skip this week. She walked to the front desk, Toby clinging to her leg. Before she could slide her debit card across the scratched counter, a massive, scarred hand placed 3 crisp $100 bills over the plastic tray. "Keep the change," Declan rumbled to the terrified receptionist. He looked at Clara. "Car's running. Let's go." "I can pay my own bills," Clara said quietly, her pride bristling. "Boss's orders," Declan replied, already turning toward the door. "He said if I let you pay, he'd have me driving a garbage truck by Tuesday." Clara swallowed her pride. She had no energy left to fight. They drove back to her apartment in silence. Declan waited until she unlocked her deadbolt before returning to the car. Clara locked the door, put Toby to bed, and stood by the window. The black sedan idled across the street for another hour, before finally pulling away into the night. 2 days later, Clara returned to the Corvin estate. She walked past the guards, hung up her coat, and pushed open the double doors to the study. The room was bright. For the first time, the heavy velvet curtains were pulled back, letting the harsh morning sun spill across the Persian rug. Elias was at his desk. He looked up when she entered. He didn't say good morning. His dark eyes simply swept over her, searching for the frayed edges. "Is the boy breathing?" Elias asked. His voice was rough, unaccustomed to asking questions that didn't involve money or violence. "He's fine. Thank you for the car, and for Declan paying the clinic. I will have the money taken out of my next paycheck." Clara walked to her desk and booted up her computer. "Don't insult me." Elias snapped, the familiar anger rising instantly. "It's not an insult, Mr. Corvin. I don't accept charity." Elias wheeled his chair out from behind the desk, navigating the space until he was beside her small workstation. "It wasn't charity. It was hazard pay." Clara paused, her hands hovering over the keyboard. She looked at him. "Hazard pay for what?" "For Dominic Russo," Elias said smoothly. He leaned back in his chair, his broad chest expanding. "You spilled boiling coffee on a man who has murdered people for looking at him sideways. You embarrassed him in my house. You neutralized a threat to my authority using a silver pot and your cheap shoes. I tripped." "You did not trip," Elias said softly. A ghost of a smirk played on his scarred lips. It was the first time she had ever seen him look remotely amused. "You calculated the trajectory, assessed the risk, and executed a strike. You are either incredibly brave, Clara, or entirely reckless." "I just wanted to get the shipping manifests filed." Elias stared at her, the smirk fading into something heavier. Something studying her. "Most people look at me and see a dead man in a chair. Dominic saw a dead man. You saw a boss who needed a distraction. I see a man who pays me $25 an hour to keep his paperwork straight," Clara corrected gently. Elias reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a thick manila envelope. He tossed it onto her desk. It landed with a heavy, distinct thud. "That is your new contract," Elias said, his tone shifting back to cold business. "Your hourly rate is now $50. Full medical coverage for you and your son. You will no longer take the bus. Declan will pick you up at 7:30 every morning and drop you off. You will not argue with me about this." Clara stared at the envelope. She felt the sudden terrifying urge to cry. Not from fear, but from the sheer, crushing relief of financial survival. She dug her fingernails into her palms to ground herself. "Why?" Clara asked, her voice tight. "Because an assistant who doesn't run when I throw glass is rare," Elias said, turning his wheelchair back toward his desk. "An assistant who puts Dominic Russo in his place is an asset, and I protect my assets. Now open the Terminal 4 files. We have a hostile takeover to plan." Paperwork was the quietest weapon in the Corvin arsenal. Clara learned this over the next 3 weeks. She didn't see the guns, the beatings, or the blood. She only saw the numbers. And the numbers told a brutal story. Elias was dismantling Dominic Russo's operation, piece by piece. Clara filed the property transfers of Dominic's warehouses. She routed the buyout funds to Dominic's corrupted union captains, buying their loyalty right out from under him. Elias was executing a flawless, bloodless siege, all from the confines of his leather wheelchair. He was changing too. The suffocating rage that used to fill the study was morphing into cold, focused energy. He still had his dark days. Days when the nerve pain left him grey and shivering. But he no longer threw things. When the spasms hit, he didn't order Clara out. He simply gripped the armrests, gritted his teeth, and waited for her to kneel and stretch his ruined legs until the fire stopped. It was an unspoken routine, intimate, clinical, and completely devoid of pity. The danger of this closeness didn't hit Clara until a Tuesday evening. Declan had dropped her off at her apartment building. The streetlights were flickering, casting long shadows across the cracked pavement. Clara walked up the concrete steps, digging in her purse for her keys. "Cute kid." Clara froze. The voice came from the shadows of the alley adjacent to her building. A man stepped into the dim light of the street lamp. He wore a heavy leather jacket and a flat cap. He held a lit cigarette between his fingers. Clara recognized him instantly. He was one of the enforcers who had stood behind Dominic Russo in Elias's conference room. Clara's blood ran ice cold. She didn't scream. Her hand moved silently inside her purse, wrapping around the small can of pepper spray she always carried. "He's got a nice little cough, doesn't he?" The man continued, taking a drag of his cigarette. "Toby, 4 years old, goes to the old lady on the 3rd floor while you play secretary for the cripple." "What do you want?" Clara asked, her voice dangerously steady. The man smiled, revealing stained teeth. "Dominic doesn't like how fast things are moving on the docks. He thinks the cripple has too much free time to look at the books. He wants Elias distracted." The man took a step closer. "You're going to start losing files, sweetheart. You're going to accidentally misplace the property deeds for the South Terminal. Or maybe Toby accidentally eats something bad at the playground. Accidents happen when people aren't paying attention." He flicked his cigarette onto the concrete, crushing it beneath his boot. He didn't touch her. He just gave her a long, hard look, turned, and disappeared back down the alley. Clara stood on the steps, her lungs burning as she realized she had stopped breathing. She ran up the 3 flights of stairs, hands shaking violently as she unlocked her door. She bolted it behind her, sprinted to the living room, and grabbed Toby, who was watching TV on the rug. She hugged him so tight, he squirmed, burying her face in his hair. The next morning, Clara walked into the Corvin estate study. She didn't take off her coat. Elias looked up from his tablet. He read her instantly. The tension in her jaw, the dark circles under her eyes, the rigid way she held her spine. "Who?" Elias asked. One word. Lethal and absolute. Clara walked to his desk. She placed her hands flat on the mahogany surface. "Dominic's man. Leather jacket, flat cap. He was waiting outside my building last night. He knew Toby's name. He knew my sitter's flaw. He told me to start losing your files." Elias didn't blink. The silence in the room became a physical weight. The air pressure seemed to drop. He didn't yell. He didn't throw a tantrum. The anger radiating from him was perfectly contained, which made it infinitely more terrifying. He reached over and pressed a button on his intercom. "Vincent!" The door opened 10 seconds later. Vincent stepped in, sensing the atmosphere immediately. His hand instinctively rested near his jacket lapel. "Dominic sent a man to Clara's home," Elias said. His voice was a calm, dead monotone. "Leather jacket, flat cap. Find him. Don't ask questions. Just break his hands. Both of them. Then drop him on Dominic's front lawn with a message." "What's the message?" Vincent asked, his face hardening into stone. "Tell Dominic the siege is over. It's an execution now. Burn the South Terminal warehouses tonight." Vincent nodded once and left the room. Clara watched Elias. He was staring at the closed door, his jaw locked tight. "I can't work for you anymore," Clara said softly. Elias whipped his wheelchair around to face her. "No." "Elias, he threatened my son. I need the money, but I will not put Toby in a coffin for it. You think quitting makes you safe?" Elias asked, his voice harsh. "You think Dominic cares if you quit? He knows you've seen the books. He knows you're my weak point. If you walk away now, you don't have my guards. You don't have my money. You have a pepper spray can and a deadbolt. That won't stop them." "Then what do I do?" Clara demanded, her voice cracking for the first time since she took the job. "I can't protect him." Elias wheeled forward until the footrests of his chair nearly touched her knees. He reached out and grabbed her wrist. His grip was entirely unbreakable. "You pack your bags," Elias said, his dark eyes boring into hers. You pack Toby's things. Declan is waiting outside. He will take you to get the boy and bring you both back here. You will live in the East Wing. There are guards on every door. There is a doctor on call. No one touches what is mine, Clara. Do you understand? No one. Clara looked at the scarred, ruthless man, holding her tethered. She was trading a slum for a fortress, but the fortress was ruled by a wolf. She looked down at his hand wrapped around her wrist. It was warm, heavy, and absolute. "Okay," Clara whispered. The iron gates of the Corvin estate had always been designed to keep the world out. As Clara rode in the back of the sedan hours later, Toby asleep with his head on her lap, she watched those heavy black gates close behind them with a loud metallic clank. She was safe. But as she looked up at the looming stone mansion, she realized she was never leaving again. Sunlight filtered through the bulletproof glass of the East Wing painting, long, warm blocks of yellow across the imported hardwood floors. It had been 4 days since the iron gates closed behind them. Clara stood by the massive bay window, holding a mug of herbal tea that had gone cold 20 minutes ago. The suite they had been given was larger than her entire previous apartment building. It possessed 2 bathrooms clad in slate and brushed nickel, a massive king-sized bed wrapped in linens that felt like spun water, and an adjoining room for Toby. The air in the estate was heavily filtered and climate-controlled. For the first time in his life, Toby hadn't coughed once during the night. He was currently sitting in the center of the plush rug, driving a plastic fire truck over the woven hills of a 200-year-old Persian carpet. He was completely oblivious to the armed guards positioned at the ends of the corridor. To Toby, it was just a giant, quiet castle. To Clara, it was a beautifully constructed vault. She set her mug down and checked her watch. It was 8 in the morning. Time to work. Stay with Maria. Clara told Toby, crouching down to kiss his forehead. Maria was the older, stern-faced housekeeper Elias had reassigned exclusively to the East Wing. "I'll come have lunch with you at noon." "Okay, Mummy," Toby said, not looking up from his truck. Clara walked out of the suite, nodding to the heavily tattooed man in the grey suit who stood outside her door. She navigated the long, silent hallways toward the main study. She could smell coffee roasting, and faintly the metallic tang of gun oil. She pushed open the heavy oak doors to the study. Elias was already at his desk. He wasn't looking at a tablet or reading files. He was staring at the wall, his jaw tight, dark circles, bruising the skin under his eyes. Vincent stood near the fireplace. His suit jacket was off his dress shirt, rolled up to the elbows. His knuckles were split, red and swollen. "Good morning," Clara said, her voice cutting through the thick tension in the room. Vincent looked over. He looked exhausted, carrying a grim satisfaction that made Clara's stomach knot. "Morning, Clara." "Did they burn?" Elias asked. He didn't look at Clara. His focus remained fixed on the middle distance. "All of them," Vincent replied, his voice rough. "The South Terminal warehouses are ash. Dominic lost $3 million in imported hardware and his primary distribution hub in less than 4 hours. He's bleeding, Elias. He's panicked. Panic makes men stupid," Elias said softly. "Where is he hiding?" He moved his inner circle to the meat-packing district, a fortified basement under one of his butcher shops. "We have men watching the perimeter, but going in will be loud. And messy." "I don't care about the noise," Elias snapped. He finally spun his wheelchair around his eyes, locking onto Vincent. "I want him in the ground by Friday. He breached the perimeter. He threatened what belongs to this house. Cut his supply lines, bribe his remaining captains, and choke him out." Clara walked to her desk and sat down. She opened her laptop. She didn't tremble. She didn't gasp. She listened to two men discuss the systematic dismantling and murder of a rival with the same clinical detachment they used for quarterly tax projections. This was the reality she had agreed to. She began pulling up the banking records for the offshore accounts, preparing to wire the bribes Vincent had just mentioned. "Clara," Elias said. She looked up. He was watching her. "Vincent is going to send you a list of 6 names. Union bosses on Dominic's payroll." Elias instructed, his voice shifting back to a calmer, authoritative timbre. "I need 50,000 transferred to each of their Cayman accounts by noon. Label them as consulting fees for the Shell Corporation." "Understood." Vincent nodded to Elias, grabbed his suit jacket, and walked out of the study, the heavy doors clicking shut behind him. The room fell quiet, save for the rapid clicking of Clara's keyboard. Elias watched her hands. He watched the steady, unflinching way she worked. "You don't ask questions," Elias noted, navigating his wheelchair closer to her desk. "You don't pay me to ask questions. You pay me to transfer funds," Clara replied, keeping her eyes on the screen. "I just ordered a man to be hunted down like an animal." Clara stopped typing. She turned her chair slightly to face him. He was probing again, testing the boundaries of her morality, waiting for the disgust to show on her face. "That man sent a thug to my home to threaten my 4-year-old child." Clara said, her voice low and completely devoid of warmth. "If I had a gun and the training, I would have gone to the South Terminal myself. I don't feel sorry for Dominic Russo. I only care that Toby is safe." Elias stared at her. The harsh lines of his scarred face softened infinitesimally. He reached out his large hand, resting on the edge of her desk. His fingers were mere inches from hers. "He is safe," Elias murmured. It wasn't a casual reassurance. It was a blood oath. Before Clara could respond, the double doors burst open. Clara jumped. Elias's hand whipped back, his posture instantly rigid. Toby ran into the room, his plastic fire truck clutched in one hand. Maria was right behind him, her face flushed with panic. "I am so sorry, Mr. Corvin," Maria gasped, grabbing Toby by the shoulder. "He slipped past the guard. He's quick." Toby looked up at Elias. He wasn't afraid. He tilted his head, taking in the massive man in the high-tech chair. "Are you the boss?" Toby asked, his small voice echoing in the massive room. The silence that followed was suffocating. Clara held her breath, ready to sprint across the room and pull her son out of the line of fire. Elias hated unpredictable variables. He hated noise. Elias looked down at the boy. He looked at the fire truck. He looked at Clara, seeing the absolute terror masked behind her stoic expression. Slowly, Elias leaned forward in his chair. He didn't smile. Clara didn't think he knew how, but his voice lost its gravelly edge. "I am," Elias said, "and in this house we don't run in the hallways. It damages the floors." "Understood," Toby nodded solemnly. "Okay. Can I play under my mum's desk?" Clara stood up. "Toby, no, you need to go back with—" "He can stay," Elias interrupted. He looked at Maria. "Leave us." Maria nodded frantically and practically fled the room. Clara watched in stunned silence as Toby crawled under her desk, immediately making quiet siren noises as he rolled his truck over the wood. She looked at Elias. Elias didn't say another word. He turned his wheelchair around, navigated back to his desk, and picked up his tablet. The absolute terrifying mafia boss had just yielded his inner sanctum to a 4-year-old with a plastic toy. Smoke hung over the southern skyline for 3 days. Clara could see the faint grey smudge from the bay window of the east wing. It was a constant visual reminder of the violence being executed in Elias's name. Inside the study, the war was fought on spreadsheets and burner phones. Clara had barely slept. She spent her days tracking the hemorrhaging numbers of Dominic's empire, and her nights listening to Toby's steady breathing, terrified that the war would somehow breach the thick stone walls of the estate. It was late Thursday night. The grandfather clock in the corner struck 11. Toby was asleep in the suite. Clara sat at her desk, the blue light of the monitor illuminating the exhaustion in her face. Elias was at his desk across the room. He had a glass of scotch in his hand, untouched. He looked terrible. The stress of the siege was aggravating his nervous system. His legs had been spasming intermittently all evening, small violent jerks that he tried to hide behind the heavy oak of his desk. "Go to bed, Clara," Elias said. His voice was raw, scraped hollow by fatigue. "I need to verify the final wire transfer to the Longshoremen Union," Clara replied, rubbing her eyes. "If we don't lock them down by midnight, Dominic might find a way to counteroffer." "Dominic doesn't have 2 pennies to rub together," Elias said. He shifted in his chair, a sudden sharp hiss escaping his teeth as a severe spasm racked his right leg. The heavy boot kicked the inside of the desk loudly. Clara stood up immediately. She walked across the room, bypassing the front of the desk entirely, and knelt beside his chair. "Don't do it to her." Elias ground out his hands, gripping the armrests, until the leather creaked. "I'm fine. Go to sleep." Clara ignored him. She reached down, took hold of his right ankle, and applied the heavy grounding pressure she knew he needed. His muscle was like a coiled steel spring under his trousers. "Breathe," Clara instructed softly. Elias dropped his head back against the headrest, his eyes squeezing shut. He breathed in deeply, his broad chest rising and falling in a ragged rhythm. He hated his body. He hated the betrayal of his own nerves. Clara kept the pressure steady. She didn't look at him with pity. She just anchored him. After 5 agonizing minutes, the tremor finally faded. The muscle loosened, returning to dead weight. Clara slowly released his ankle and sat back on her heels. She looked up. Elias was already watching her. His dark eyes were heavy, completely stripped of the cold armor he wore for the rest of the world. In the dim light of the study, he looked devastatingly human. "You shouldn't be downed there," Elias whispered. "It's just a flaw," Clara said, brushing a speck of dust from her trousers. "You know what I mean." Elias reached out. His large, calloused hand hesitated for a fraction of a second before he gently cupped her jaw. His thumb brushed over her cheekbone. The touch was incredibly light, a stark contrast to the violence he possessed. Clara froze. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She didn't pull away. The warmth of his palm was electric. "I am a broken man, Clara." Elias said, his voice a low, gravelly vibration in the quiet room. "I sit in this chair and I burn the city down because I can't walk through it anymore. I am dangerous. I am angry. And I cannot protect you the way a man should. If someone breached that door right now, I couldn't stand in front of you." Clara looked into his eyes. She saw the deep, festering shame that fueled his rage. He didn't feel like a king. He felt like a liability. She reached up and wrapped her hand around his wrist. She didn't pull his hand away from her face. She pressed it closer. "I don't need a man to stand in front of me," Clara said, her voice fiercely steady. "I need a man who makes sure the door never gets breached in the first place. You burned an entire empire to ash to keep my son safe. You didn't need legs to do that." Elias exhaled a shaky, surrendered breath. He leaned forward in his chair, closing the distance between them. "Clara," he murmured, his face inches from hers. "Vincent is going to walk through that door in 10 minutes with the final casualty report." Clara whispered, her eyes dropping briefly to his scarred lips. "Let him knock," Elias replied. He closed the gap. The kiss was not gentle. It was desperate, hungry, and heavy with months of suppressed tension. Clara leaned into it, her hands moving up to grip the broad line of his shoulders. He tasted like expensive scotch and absolute power. Elias's hand moved from her jaw to the back of her neck, pulling her up and closer, burying his face in her hair. For a moment, the war, the ledgers, and the wheelchair ceased to exist. There was only the brutal magnetic gravity between them. A sharp, heavy knock on the double door shattered the quiet. They broke apart instantly. Elias sat back, his chest heaving, his eyes burning into hers. Clara stood up quickly, smoothing her blouse, her cheeks flushed, her pulse roaring in her ears. "Come in," Elias barked, his voice instantly returning to cold iron. Vincent stepped into the room. He looked at Elias, then at Clara, his sharp eyes missing nothing but commenting on absolutely zero. "It's done," Vincent said quietly. Elias held Clara's gaze for a second longer before turning to his right-hand man. "Dominic, cornered in the basement. He didn't make it out." Vincent held up a small, blood-stained gold pinky ring. Dominic's ring. He tossed it onto Elias's desk. It spun with a hollow metallic ring before settling onto the polished mahogany. "The South Docks belong to you." Elias looked at the ring. The war was over. He had won. He looked back at Clara standing by her desk, fiercely beautiful and entirely his. "No," Elias said softly, his dark eyes fixed on her. "They belong to us." Rain washed the soot from the southern skyline. 6 weeks had passed since Dominic Rousseau's gold ring hit the mahogany desk. The Corvin estate had shifted. It was no longer just a fortress. It was an empire running at peak efficiency. And Clara was at the center of the machinery. She stood in the master bathroom of the East Wing, buttoning a tailored silk blouse. She had traded her cheap, scuffed loafers for Italian leather heels. The dark circles under her eyes were gone. Toby's asthma hadn't flared up in a month. They were surviving. More than surviving. They were thriving in the shadow of a monster. She walked into the main study. Elias was by the window. He wore a crisp white shirt, his cuffs rolled up. The heavy woolen blanket usually covering his legs was gone, replaced by sharply pressed dark trousers. He didn't hide his paralysis anymore, at least not from her. "Morning," Clara said, setting her coffee on her desk. Elias turned his wheelchair. His eyes dragged over her, holding a dark, possessive heat that still made her pulse skip. He rolled forward and stopped right in front of her. He reached out, taking her hand. He didn't kiss it. He opened her palm and dropped something heavy and cold into it. It was a key. Heavy brass antique. "What is this?" Clara asked, running her thumb over the jagged teeth. "The safety deposit box in Zurich," Elias said flatly. "It holds the deeds to the shipping yards, the union contracts, and 30 million in bearer bonds. The account requires 2 signatures now, mine and yours." Clara stared at the key. This wasn't a promotion. This was a coronation. "Elias, I'm your assistant." You haven't been my assistant since you tripped Dominic over a coffee pot," Elias replied. He grabbed her waist, pulling her forward, until her knees brushed the metal of his chair. "You are my partner. If something happens to me, the empire doesn't fracture. It transfers. To you." "Nothing is going to happen to you," Clara said, her voice fiercely protective. She gripped the collar of his shirt. "I live in a wheelchair, Clara. I have enemies who breathe every day just to see me dead. I need to know my house is secure." He looked up at her, the scarred side of his face catching the morning light. "I need to know you and the boy are untouchable." The heavy double doors creaked open. Toby trotted in, He was wearing miniature suspenders and holding a tablet playing a loud cartoon. He didn't hesitate. He walked straight up to Elias's wheelchair, climbing onto the metal footrest and settling comfortably between Elias's paralyzed legs to watch his screen. Elias didn't flinch. He just rested a massive scarred hand lightly on Toby's head. It was a casual gesture, completely natural. Clara watched them, the ruthless crime lord and the boy with bad lungs. "Vincent wants to know if you're taking the meeting with the Irish syndicate at noon," Clara said, clearing her throat to hide the sudden tightness in her chest. "Tell Vincent to set the boardroom," Elias said, his thumb absent-mindedly stroking Toby's hair. "And you're sitting at the table today, not behind me. Next to me." Clara nodded. She slipped the brass key into her pocket. "I'll review the terms of their import tax." At noon, the boardroom was suffocatingly tense. 4 men from the Irish syndicate sat across the oak table. They were hard, violent men. They stared at Elias's wheelchair with barely concealed contempt. Then they looked at Clara. She sat directly to Elias's right, a leather binder open in front of her. She didn't look like a secretary. She looked like a judge. "We want 20% of the North Docks," the Irish leader, a thick-necked man named Sullivan, demanded. "We move the cargo, we take our cut. Standard." Elias didn't answer. He just looked at Clara. Clara closed her binder. The sound echoed like a gunshot. "You get 12%, she said. Her voice was absolute ice. "And you pay your own dock fees. You don't use our union labor, and if a single crate goes missing, we take the cost out of your 12%, Sullivan sneered. He looked at Elias. "You let your nurse negotiate your contracts now, Corvin." The air in the room froze. Vincent, standing by the door, unbuttoned his suit jacket. Elias didn't yell. He leaned forward, resting his thick forearms on the table. He looked at Sullivan with eyes that held the absolute promise of violence. "She's not a nurse," Elias said softly. "She's the woman who holds the keys to my city. And if you ever disrespect her in my house again, I will have Vincent cut out your tongue and mail it to your wife." Sullivan swallowed hard. The color drained from his face. He looked back at Clara. She was staring right back at him, completely unbothered by the threat of mutilation. 12%, Clara repeated calmly. "Do we have a deal, Mr. Sullivan?" Sullivan nodded stiffly. "We have a deal." They left minutes later. The room emptied, leaving only Elias and Clara. Elias turned his chair to face her. 12%, I was going to give them 15. "They were desperate," Clara said, packing up her files. "They lost their warehouse lease last week. They had 0 leverage. Never pay full price for desperate men." Elias let out a low, rough laugh. It was a beautiful sound. He reached out, grabbing her hand and pulling her onto his lap. Clara went willingly, wrapping her arms around his broad shoulders. She didn't care about the paralysis. She didn't care about the blood on his ledgers. 14 assistants quit, Elias murmured against her neck, his breath warm against her skin. "They didn't have my overhead," Clara replied, tangling her fingers in his hair. Elias tilted her chin up, forcing her to look into his dark, devoted eyes. "You're never quitting, Clara. You're mine." Clara kissed him hard and deep, tasting the absolute power they now shared. "I'm not quitting," she whispered against his scarred mouth. "I'm taking over." That concludes the intense, slow-burn saga of Clara and Elias Corvin. She walked in as a desperate temp and walked out as the undisputed queen of a criminal empire. Did you love seeing Clara take charge and put the Irish syndicate in their place? Let us know your favorite moment in the comments below. If you want more dark romance, gripping mafia dramas, and stories of unstoppable women, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and click the notification bell. Share this video with someone who loves a fierce heroine. Until next time, stay strong.